Thanks very much, Sheila, and everyone else who. In particular, I have to thank Jane Speedy because it was meeting Jane, the fabulous Jane, at the Quality of Inquiry conference for the first time about 5 years ago, and then following the work of the people at the Narrative Inquiry Centre and people who've done their doctoral studies with Jane and other people here. That has been, one of the most exciting groups of people I've met in my decade in academia. So it's a privilege to be here. And when I came up with when I said neoliberalism in education, now I'm not, I needed to come up with my own take on this thread of educational research. So this is my peculiar idiosyncratic take on what I'm interested in interrupting as much as I can, neoliberalism in education. And of course I have to talk about my context, so I wouldn't presume to make any statements about the UK context. Okay? So I'm going to take you through a little journey in two sections. Sheila did give me 3 hours. I thought, wow, what a gift. I won't talk for 3 hours, I hope, I'm sure. But I've organised it into two sections, because I didn't know what people were interested in. One part is about schools and neoliberal, what I'm thinking of as neoliberal policies impacting on the school sector in Australia. And the other part is around higher education. In the schools part, I've got 3 different sort of areas, and I've got 3 papers that are coming out imminently in 3 different journals that speak to those policies. The higher education section, I have a lot to say, but I haven't written it yet.
You're going to write that by tomorrow, then?
Yes. So, and I've got some notes here. Now, if you've read any of my earlier work, you'll know that the sorts of things I'm interested in are all over the place, and they haven't. I decided really deliberately last year that there were spaces I wanted to speak into that were more politically charged in some ways, that might have more impact than on schools where the people I'm teaching are working. So this is where these papers come from. I'm going to have to put the glasses on so I can read the notes. But I wanted to, if I'm going to work in a new area, to write into a new area, policy research, I wanted to bring my particular skill set into that arena. So how can I write about policy, even though I'm not a policy sociologist? How can I write about it in my own way, in a way that's not other people's, that brings in what I've done in experimental sorts of writing practices. And part of this is completely strategic as well, in that if I want to do more, a lot of educational research for people who are academics is absolutely reliant on funding. I can't go in and do research in a school unless I've got enough money from somewhere to pay the schools for the time of the teachers in Australia. Schools expect you to pay at least about $350 a day for every teacher. So schools are self-managing economic units looking to maximise their income. So I wanted to get enough of a track record to be able to apply for funding to do more research, empirical research in schools. So the sorts of work that makes available are, for example, there's 2 big Australian Research Council grants. Barbara Comer has one where she's gone into schools around the country to talk to them about, to talk to principals about how they're enacting mandated literacy assessment. But it's because she can afford to go into the schools and do the interviews and get them transcribed and have research assistants that it's such a robust program. And Bob Lingard at the University of Queensland is doing a project where he's going in and interviewing policymakers as well as about their intentions, as well as people in the school sector about how they... So that's the sort of research you can afford if you've got funding. So what I wanted to do here is look across the various projects in terms of three big ideas: matter, affect and narrative. Now, in the papers that you've read, that you might read, these aren't all flagged in a significant way, but they are my sort of the backstory and what links all of it together, I think. So, I thought I'd start, given its narrative, I thought I'd start, I wouldn't take notes too much, don't worry too much about that. I'm going to just take you on a bit of a journey that hopefully is interesting enough in itself. So I'm starting with a novel. Has anyone read this novel? This is the cover image. It's called Perlman's Silence, and I picked it up on my travels, actually at the airport in Las Palmas in the Canaries in July. And I thought it was fabulous because Perlman's an academic. He's a linguist in a university the author, Pascal Mercier, is a philosophy professor in Berlin, apparently. So he's written this novel about an academic called Perlman, who's having a crisis. In terms of the neoliberal university, Perlman's, I'll just go back a moment, he's at the top of his game. He's very well known, he's very good at getting grants, he's got corporate sponsorship for his work. In fact, Olivetti, what used to be a typewriting company, I don't know what they do now, he has sponsored a 5-week writing retreat on the edge of a lake in Italy for him and the best people in his field that he wants to invite from all over the world. So what happens to Perlman is, he's also written lots of books, he's got an invitation to Stanford for next year, so he's the epitome of a successful university professor. What happens is though, I'll try not to tell you too much, it's a good book, he's paralysed, he can't write there. So the shame of being a non-performer in this sort of university context is so great that one person who can't come from Russia, he passes off that guy's paper as his own, sort of inadvertently, through a misunderstanding, and then that person suddenly gets a visa and is coming, so Perlman has to kill him rather than face the shame of being caught out plagiarising. So it's
one way too.
what they call a krimi in German. Anyway, I enjoyed it very much, and so many parts of it resonated with me, I couldn't believe it. Not the killing people, but the way that it's very, very introspective too. So I thought I'd just get into the ideas of matter, affect and narrative through this small excerpt. He had the feeling that he didn't really know what it was like, academic work. It wasn't writer's block, it wasn't stage fright, it was something else, something he had only recognised after a long time and with quiet horror, the very precise feeling that he had nothing to say. Fundamentally, he found it ridiculous walking down the centre aisle of the lecture theatre under the expectant eyes of the students. With almost every step, the sensation grew that he was stealing their time from them. Then he opened his notes and began to speak in his practised, fluent way. He was well known for being able to speak apparently off the top of his head. The students liked him. Often several of them came up to the lectern afterwards and wanted to know more. That was particularly bad. During the lecture, the empty space between lecturing desks had protected him, had acted as a protecting screen behind which he was able to hide his lack of interest, that stigma. When the students sat in front of him, he felt unprotected and worried that they might see he was no longer involved. He took refuge in solicitous eagerness, spoke far too verbosely, filled up another blackboard, and promised to bring the appropriate books along the next time. In many cases, they were his own, which he pressed into the students' hands like bribes. They felt they were being taken seriously, understood, a committed professor. They needed to know him personally and invited him to join their table at the pub. So, Perlman. So this is a strange sort of a launch pad, but go with me. So we'll just take this as a little case study. I think this excerpt is saturated with what I'm calling affect. It's, we can see his fears, his feelings of absurdity or ridiculousness, his worry that he's going to be caught out, his overcompensating eagerness and excitability, but also his students' enthusiasm and their responsiveness. They need to relate to him not only intellectually, but in a much more intimate way that even exceeds the space of learning. They want him to come to the pub. And by affect, naming all those flows as affective flows, it's not just emotion. Sometimes emotions, it's more than emotions that are located just within the individual. They're sensations that are deeply embodied, that aren't always able to be rationalised, and that flow as intensities from person to person. They have bodily effects. They make him freeze or falter. They arise in particular contexts and relations from second to second, really, shifts. And they're capable of moving and transforming. And theoretically, this sort of approach to affect is more, although there are other approaches to affect, like typologies, like work that uses Sylvan Tompkins, this is a Deleuzian approach, really, to look at flows and intensities and that pass between bodies. And in the learning context, they're very interesting because they're mobile, but they're also mobilising. They're animated and they're animating. They're more or less contagious or sticky. Some people use the term sticky as they circulate, and they travel between and across bodies. So if you think about contexts of learning as affective zones where the capacity to animate learning is really crucial, I think that's a very interesting way to look at educational contexts. Anyway, for Perlman, through habit, and through his experience and despite his anxieties, he performs. He enacts enthusiasm, and he sort of becomes enthusiastic by doing it, at least enough for his students to catch that flow of energy and arouse their desire to learn. And there's two people at my university, just as an aside. Megan Watkins has written a lovely book called Discipline and Learn that just came out earlier this year about particularly learning to write in primary schools through affect and how affect enables a disposition to learn. Very good book. And David Cole, who's come to UWS this year, has written a lot about a Deleuzian approach to multiple literacies theory, where he looks at literature and its capacity to move and to engage affect. So affect was the first big idea I wanted to talk about. The next one is matter. Just find a bit in my notes here. Okay, the matter. So some theorists have talked about a material turn that follows the discursive turn of a decade or two ago. So now, while we were so obsessed with language, perhaps we forgot to look at things that are more material. So if we start to look at matter, it incorporates non-human and non-animate elements of any context, and thinking of them as also potentially active and agentic in that context, in that they have force in shaping what's going on and what can be seen or understood. In a Deleuzian approach, organisms, both human and non-human, and all sorts of matter are understood as entangled in socio-material assemblages or networks. Other approaches might be through Bruno Latour and Calvin Law's actor network theory, or through new work in science studies from Karen Barrage and Hilary Lenz Taguchi in education in Stockholm. It talks about agential materialism, and it has done lovely work on early childhood contexts of learning. And so back to all of those approaches are united in that they insist that we can't properly comprehend social spaces without also attending to matter itself and how matter moves, shapes and affects everything that's going on. Studies of architecture, of furniture, of space and light in education, for example, indicate this sort of attention to the material. I saw a great paper at Easter about the Bauhaus movement of buildings and site in Germany, and how the buildings themselves were pedagogical, which is very interesting. So Perlman, if we go back to here, the particular design of the lecture theatre, the centre aisle, the lectern, the blackboard, the desks, the empty space, all of those are instrumental in shaping what's going on there and what sort of learning is possible and what sort of relationality between the students and the professor is possible. But the matter of teaching and learning includes much more than this. Think about pedagogical materials and apparatus of all sorts. Curriculum documents, government and institutional policies, textbooks, technologies, equipment, and many other entangled elements come together to form teaching and learning assemblages that enable different relations between particular individual teachers and learners that might be different in this room than they are in the room, the next room and in the next room. So they're quite particular, I think. And the teachers and learners, they're particular and they differ because the teachers and learners themselves are also parts of the assemblage and they differ as well. So I think it's interesting that if you go to people like who I've been reading most recently in this area, Stephen Ball in the UK, so policy researchers in education, Bob Lingard in Australia, and yes, they, as well as being researchers at a sort of abstract level, they are absolutely insistent that it has to always be accompanied by research on the ground in particular sites of practice. You can't talk about policy until you go in and look at how it's enacted on the ground and how it is often enacted in ways that aren't anticipated by, or that are quite creative or subversive of the intentions of the policymakers in the first place. So, okay, so there's a call to specificity and to attend to the local, I think, in their work. But apart from the education policy people, the inspiration I got were from three other scholars. One of them is certainly an educational researcher, policy researcher. But they gave me this clue about narrative, and I'll just show you. Ian Stronach, do you know Ian Stronach's always surprising work, but he had a line in this great book, Globalising Education, that said in an article in a chapter about policy, that narrative is the key. Narrative empowers contradiction, he said, and lets history, ethics and desire back in. Patty Lather from Ohio wrote a book called Engaging Science Policy in 2010. And she said, as she has in other places, that we need a disciplined messiness that pays attention simultaneously to language, bodies and material conditions. What better than narrative to do that, I thought. And Stephen Ball seemed to also be pointing to narrative in his comment in, I can't remember the name of the book, that the denial of the primacy of human relationships in the production of value in education erases the social. Also, to me, given my orientation, to legitimise thinking about narrative in educational policy. And then I went to a talk by Peggy Kamhoff. So Kamhoff was an American who was a translator of Derrida, and she came to UWS and gave us this talk only a year or two ago, based on a 2007 paper called Accountability. So accountability. So she did a very Derridean reading of accountability. She put the in the middle of it was a stutter. She wanted to make the concept stutter and break apart. And she talks about accountability. She was talking about the university context has replaced thinking by counting, as if numeric representation had the greatest gravity, density or solidity. It would be what is left at the bottom of the testing container once all other superfluous floating matter, language, discourse, narrative, testimony, belief and unbelief has been poured off and discarded. Of course, I don't want those things to be discarded. I want them to be attended to as well.